Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar covering moderation and mediation. And just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to give you this contact information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar. We do provide full service dissertation consulting that helps with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, then you can use this information to contact us and learn more about the services that we provide. All right, so first I'm just going to give an overview of what we are going to be covering in the presentation today. So we'll be discussing moderation and mediation. We'll be discussing what each one of those things is and the differences between moderation and mediation. We'll talk about how to choose whether to do a moderation or a mediation analysis. And then we'll also talk about the different statistical techniques that are appropriate to use to test moderation and mediation. And then at the end, we'll have time for a question and answer session. So we will be saving the questions for the end of the presentation, but if you do have a question, you may type it into the questions section. And then at the end of the presentation, if your question hasn't already been answered, we will go through and spend some time answering questions at the end. Okay, so first let's talk about moderation. So what is moderation? A moderator is a variable that changes the strength or the direction of a relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. So in other words, a moderator is a third variable that influences the nature of the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So an example of this might be something like different teaching methods. So different teaching methods might be effective or ineffective for different types of students. So certain teaching methods might work better for boys or girls, or certain teaching methods might work better or worse for students of different ages or from different cultural backgrounds. So in that case, things like gender, age, and cultural background might act as a moderator that influences whether or not a certain teaching method may be effective. And so moderators can be categorical or continuous. So an example of a categorical moderator might be gender. So there may be a relationship between the independent and dependent variable for women, but this same relationship might not exist for men. And then moderators can also be continuous. So age can be a moderator, so just someone's age in years. So for example, with age, the relationship between the independent and dependent variable might change as people get older. And so moderation basically tells us under what conditions the independent and dependent variable will be related to each other. So it tells us when a relationship will exist between two variables. And just to show some examples of what moderation might look like, say you're conducting an experiment with two conditions, condition A and condition B, and you want to see if gender moderates the effect of your experimental conditions. In the top example, we see that moderation is occurring because in condition A, there is no difference between males and females, but in condition B, we see that the condition has an effect for females, but it does not have an effect for males. In the lower example, we see a complete crossover moderation or interaction where the effect of the condition is reversed for males and females. So in condition A, males are scoring higher than females, but the opposite is true in condition B. In condition B, females are scoring higher than males. So we can see examples of, in the top example, gender may affect whether the condition has any effect at all. And in the bottom example, we see how gender can completely reverse the effects of certain conditions or variables. Now let's talk about mediation. So what exactly is mediation and how is it different from moderation? A mediator is an intervening variable that accounts for the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Now that might sound similar to moderation, but what mediation is looking at is quite different from moderation. Instead of seeing if a third variable changes the nature of the relationship, we're looking to see if the mediating variable is playing some kind of role in the process that links the independent variable to the dependent variable. So in mediation, we are testing to see if the independent variable affects the mediator, and then in turn, if that mediator affects the dependent variable. So in other words, we are looking at kind of a chain of influence or a process by which the independent variable affects the dependent variable. And we might suspect that a mediator or an intervening variable plays some kind of role in the middle of that process. And so a mediator can either fully or partially account for the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So you can have either full mediation or partial mediation. And so, in other words, mediation tells us about the process through which the independent variable and the dependent variable are related. So instead of telling us under what conditions a relationship exists, mediation helps explain why a relationship exists between the independent and dependent variables. To kind of explain this in an analogy, let's say that you are ordering a pizza. So in the process of ordering a pizza, on the surface, it just seems like you make a phone call and then sometime later a pizza arrives at your door. But in reality, a lot of different things happen in between that phone call and the pizza arriving that is at play in that process. So a lot of things have to happen in order for that pizza to arrive after the phone call is made. So you place the phone call to relay your order, and then your order has to be relayed to the cooks in the kitchen, and then the cooks have to put all the ingredients together to make the pizza, and then they have to put the pizza in the oven to cook the pizza, and then once the pizza is cooked, it has to be given to the delivery driver, who then finally delivers it to your door. So there's this whole chain of processes that occurs between the phone call and you actually getting your pizza. And what mediation looks like, or looks at rather, is all of those processes in the middle, where you can think of the independent variable is kind of the start of the process, the dependent variable is the end of the process, and the mediators are all of the variables that work in between, in the middle of that process, to make those effects happen. To put this in more of an academic example, let's consider the effects of manager leadership style on employee satisfaction. So there are a lot of different studies out there that show how leadership styles of bosses or supervisors or managers may affect the work satisfaction of employees. But there may be variables that act in between that process and serve as mediators. So in this case, we can look at effectiveness as a mediator, where the manager's leadership style influences how effectively they manage their duties and their employees, and that effectiveness in turn is what influences, fully or in part, the job satisfaction of the employees. So now that we've covered what moderation and mediation are and kind of the differences between them, now let's talk about when you should study moderation and when you should study mediation. So how do you choose between the two when you are setting up your research study? In general, it's appropriate to use moderation when there are mixed or inconsistent findings about the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. To explain this a little bit more, if you're looking in the literature and the findings about the relationship between the independent and dependent variable are really inconsistent, like some studies find that there is a relationship, other studies find that there's not a relationship, that might be a good cause to look at moderation, because if we go back to what moderation actually is, it tells us under what conditions does a relationship exist between the independent and dependent variables. So if you can identify potential variables that may impact the relationship between the independent and dependent variable and help explain why the findings are mixed or inconsistent, you can help explain why some studies are finding a relationship while other studies aren't, if you can identify those potential moderators. And so that's why if the relationships in the literature are either mixed or inconsistent or not completely well understood, then that would be a good case to use moderation. Whereas with mediation, you want to use that generally if the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable is already well known and established. Because really one of the prerequisites for mediation is that there is a relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So you wouldn't really be doing mediation if we didn't already know that that relationship existed. So you use mediation when that relationship is already known, but you're trying to figure out more about that relationship. Again, mediation looks at the process of what drives the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So you want to use mediation to look at potential variables that are involved in that process. However, you can't just pick, any variable out of the blue to be a mediator. It's worth noting that the choice of mediators requires very careful theoretical and practical considerations. So for instance, let's take the example of age. Generally, you wouldn't want to use something like age as a mediator, because when you're picking mediators, you're picking intervening variables or variables that act in the middle of some kind of process between the independent and dependent variables. But with something like age, where it's kind of a set immutable characteristic of a person, you're not going to find a lot of independent variables that are affecting how old somebody is. Age wouldn't really fit in the middle of some process between an independent and a dependent variable, generally. So in that case, age probably would not be a good candidate for a mediator. So if you're going to look at mediation, you have to be very careful and have very good justification from both a practical and theoretical standpoint in terms of the variables that you are choosing. And just as one final note on moderation versus mediation, There are some designs and statistical models that can actually look at both moderation and mediation simultaneously. And I've left a reference for an article or an example of an article that explains how that can be done. I won't go into an incredible amount of detail on that for the purposes of this presentation, but just for your information, it is possible to look at both moderation and mediation in the same study, but it requires a bit of a more complex analysis. So finally, let's go over the different statistical techniques that you can use to test for moderation and mediation. So for testing moderation, there are a couple different techniques that you can use. If you're looking at all categorical variables, so a categorical independent variable and a categorical moderator, you can test for moderation in the framework of analysis of variance, or ANOVA. So in an ANOVA, you can look at multiple independent variables, and in this case, one can be your actual independent variable, another independent variable can be your moderator, and in ANOVA, you can compute both main effects and interaction effects for the independent variables in the analysis. And those interaction effects are actually what test moderation in this case. So when you're computing an interaction or looking at an interaction effect between two variables, you're actually seeing if one variable is moderating the other. So one way to analyze moderation is through ANOVA. Another way is through moderated regression analysis. So a regression analysis would work for both categorical and continuous variables. So a moderated regression would kind of serve as a general purpose approach to moderation. And in this case, for the regression, you would just calculate an interaction term that you would add to your model. And that interaction term is just a simple multiplication of the values for the independent variable and the moderator. And so what about mediation? What are the statistical techniques we can use for that? Well, the most basic statistical technique for mediation is to establish mediation through a series of regressions, and this is what's known as the Barron and Kenny method. However, it's becoming increasingly preferred, instead of using the Barron and Kenny method, to directly calculate the mediation effects. So this would be the calculation of indirect effects. And this can be done in a number of different types of analyses. There is the process macro, for instance, which is compatible with a number of different stats programs, such as SPSS or SAS. And the process macro allows you to conduct various types of regression analyses where the indirect or mediating effect can be calculated. And other types of analyses, such as path analysis and structural equation modeling, can also provide calculations of indirect effects, which give you tests of mediation. And so now what I'm going to do before we get to the questions is just show you a couple of examples in our intellective statistics software of how you can run both moderation and mediation analyses. So I have our software open here, and I just have an example data set where I have an independent variable that is continuous. I also have a categorical independent variable over here, and I have a dependent variable, and I have here a mediating variable, and I have here gender, which I'm going to use as a moderating variable. And so to do some moderation analyses, I'm going to go over into our analyses, and first I'm going to use an ANOVA to test for moderation. So we can go over here and run an ANOVA, and I would just set up my dependent variable and my independent variables, which would be my IV and my moderator, which is gender. And then I also want to say that I want the interaction between the independent variable and gender, because that interaction term is what establishes if moderation is occurring. So I can enter in those variables and run that analysis. And we can see that we get the results for our analysis of variance. And we see the effects of our ANOVA table here. We get our main effects for the independent variable and for gender. And here is our interaction. And we see that our interaction is significant, which tells us that there is significant moderation going on. And then we can also see some plots here, similar to the ones that I showed earlier, which shows kind of the difference in the relationship between the IV and the DV dependent on gender. So that's how you would run a moderation using an ANOVA. We could also do this in the context of a regression analysis with a moderated regression. So to do that, I'm going to go over into our advanced analyses, and I'm going to select moderation. And here I could just simply input the dependent variable, independent variable, and moderator. So I'm going to select my dependent variable. I'm going to select my independent variable, which in this case will be continuous. And I'll select my moderator variable, which is gender. And we can run that analysis. And again, we can look at our results, and we can see that through the regression method, we look at a model down here, which has the interaction between the independent variable and gender. And we see that this interaction term is significant. And again, we can see a plot here, which shows us the difference in the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable based on gender. In this case, it looks like the relationship is stronger for females compared to males. And so those are some examples of how you could run moderation analyses. So now let's look at mediation. So for mediation, in the Analecta software, we can do this specifically with the mediation command under the advanced analyses. And here we would just select again, the dependent variable, the independent variable, and our mediating variable. And we can run that analysis. And when we use the mediation option in this software, it will run the analysis using that Barron and Kenny method, so the series of regressions that we mentioned earlier. We can look at our results. It'll show us the results for the different series of regressions that we can use to test if mediation is occurring. And then finally, another way that we can test for mediation, if we don't want to use the Barron and Kenny method, is to do something like a path analysis. So we can go here to our path modeling analyses, and we can select path analysis. And we can indicate that we want to do a mediation. And again, we just select our dependent variable, independent variable, and mediator. And we can add the regressions, and it will show us that these are the different regressions or regression paths that we need in order to test for mediation. We can add those to our analysis, and we can run that analysis. and we get our results for our path analysis. So this shows us the different regression coefficients for the different paths, and it shows us coefficients for both the indirect effect and total effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. And to test for mediation, what we really want to see is that indirect effect. So it shows us the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable through the mediator. And in this case, we see that that indirect effect is not significant. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier with different analyses that can directly compute the indirect effect for mediation. Path analysis would be one of those analyses. So you can actually see if that indirect effect is statistically significant. In this case, it's not. So in this example, we do not have evidence for mediation. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. And again, here's some information in case you are interested in additional one-on-one support beyond these webinars. And with that, I will go ahead and get into the questions. And let's just see what questions we have in here. Okay, so first, let's see. Okay, so the question is, what if one of the IVs is also a mediator with the other IVs in the regression analysis? Would you do a mediation regression analysis the same way that you've presented today? So I think maybe what you're suggesting is multiple mediators in a model. So like other IVs could also potentially act as mediators. So instead of just having one mediator, you could have multiple potential mediators that, like we saw in the example with the chain of events that bring the pizza to our door. There could be multiple variables that act in that process between the independent and the dependent variable. So you could set this up with regressions similar to like we did in the examples. So you can establish different regression paths with additional mediators. You just have to set up a mediation kind of at each step where the next variable in the chain kind of serves as the independent variable, which goes to a new mediator, which then goes to the dependent variable. So you can set up path analyses specifically that have a chain of effects and look at the indirect effects that occur in between those. Not sure if that fully answers your question, but basically it is yes, you can look at the multiple mediators or have, IVs that also serve as mediators with other IVs. It is possible to set up models like that. And if you're doing a complex model like that, you can do something like a path analysis, and also if you're using something like the process macro to do mediation, there are different advanced models that you can run using the process macro that support things like multiple mediators or moderated mediation or all different kinds of more complicated or advanced analyses. Okay, let's see what other questions we have. I think one person looks like was just asking to go over the output again when we were looking at the results for those analyses that we ran. So I'm going to go ahead and just go over that quickly because I did kind of go over that pretty fast. But going back to our the ANOVA that we ran to test for moderation. So again, we did an ANOVA where we had a categorical independent variable and gender as our moderator. And so if we look at our result for that, we can see in our table, we have both main effects, a main effect for our independent variable, a main effect for our moderator, which is gender, and the interaction between the independent variable and the moderator, which in essence is the test of our moderating effect. And so we look to see if that interaction term is significant. And in this example, it is. So we know that there is significant moderation going on between gender and the independent variable. And then we can see that visualized in this graph down here, which is similar to the examples that we looked at earlier, where it shows us the difference in the relationship between the IV and the DV based on gender. So in this case, it seems like the relationship is a bit stronger for females than it is for males. And then for the moderated regression, we can look at the result there, and it's pretty similar to what we saw with the ANOVA analysis, where we establish a regression model that has our independent variable, our dependent variable, or our moderator, and the interaction term between the independent variable and the moderator. And specifically to establish if moderation is going on, we want to see if that interaction term is significant. And in this case, it is. And again, we can look at a line plot like this to see what the nature of that moderating effect is. And we see that the relationship between the IV and the DV appears to be stronger for females than it is for males. And next, for mediation analysis, again, this first example is when we did the Barron and Kenny method. And in the Barron and Kenny method, we establish a series of regressions to see if mediation is occurring. So specifically, in the first regression, we see if the independent variable is related to the dependent variable, which, as we discussed earlier in the presentation, you really only want to do mediation when it's already pretty well established that the independent and dependent variables are related. So we would expect this relationship to be significant, and it is. And then in the second regression, we establish that there's a significant relationship between the independent variable and the mediator, in which case this is significant. And then in the final regression, in order to see if mediation is taking place via the Barron and Kenny method, what we would do is we would put both the independent variable and mediator in the regression model. And if the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable is no longer significant when we enter in the mediator, then that would be evidence that full mediation is occurring. But in this case, that's not what we're seeing, because in this final model, the independent variable is still related to the dependent variable. This relationship is still significant. So we do not have evidence for full mediation in this case. However, we can also look at mediation through something like a path analysis, like what we saw here. And so we can look at the different effects of our regression paths between the independent variable, mediator, and dependent variable. And specifically, we can look at the indirect effect, which tests to see if there's an indirect effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable through the mediator. And if that indirect effect is significant, then we would have evidence for mediation. But in this case, we see that it is not significant. Okay, so the next, looks like we have a question of, can you give an example of structural equation modeling? So with structural equation modeling, it would actually work almost identically to what we have for path analysis. Really, the difference between structural equation modeling and path analysis is that in structural equation modeling, you use latent variables rather than computed or observed variables. So in this example data set, the way we have this set up is that we just already have a score computed for our independent variable, dependent variable, and mediator. If you were doing structural equation modeling, then your independent variable might actually be, for instance, some construct that's made up of several different items, which make it a latent variable. And so instead of just having this computed score for the independent variable, you would have maybe, say, 5 or 10 items that make up the independent variable, and those would form a latent construct in your structural equation model. And then the same thing would be true maybe for your dependent variable and for your mediator. But the principle behind testing for mediation between structural equation modeling and path analysis is the same. You're still just setting up this relationship between, or set of relationships between the independent, dependent, and mediator. The only differences in structural equation modeling is that those independent, dependent, and mediating variables are or can be latent variables, whereas in path analysis, you're only working with computed or observed variables. Okay. And so I think it looks like those are all of the questions that we have so far. I will go ahead and wait another minute or two to see if anybody else has any additional questions before we end the presentation for today. So if you do have any additional questions, you can go ahead and type those in now. Okay, I haven't received any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation there. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you found this presentation useful. We do have other webinars in case you're interested in other specific topics involved in the dissertation process. And again, I have this information on the screen now, which is our contact information. If you are interested in more one-on-one support or learning about the one-on-one services that we have to offer outside of these webinars. Thanks everyone again for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.